So I'll be talking about fixing objectively bad models in LP performance evaluations. And this is something that I think has plagued the industry for a really long time. And it's one of the things where I think that this is an objective truth, right? This isn't like an opinion that I'm sharing with you today. I'm not, inviting you to speculate with me on whether or not what I'm saying is true. I know it to be true. Right, this is something that I think is, is not subject to debate. And the idea is that I can prove this using things like fundamentals in mathematical analysis. And so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to start with the model that I think everyone is most familiar with. It might be presented in a slightly unfamiliar form, but I think almost everyone in the room will probably recognize this as being the constant product liquidity pool. And this is the simple two-dimensional equal weights version. And just a quick note on notation here. I'm using delta X and delta Y to represent the change in a token balance, but where any positive delta X is necessarily coupled with a negative delta Y, and vice versa. And if they're both, if one of them is 0, then they must both be 0. So with that out of the way, it's often the case where once you have one of these invariant equations, you can derive a swap equation from this. So all I'm saying here is that once you know that this relationship at the top is mandated to be true, then it's very easy to rearrange this equation in order to isolate either delta y or delta x. And now you're in the position of being able to create a function on a smart contract that says for any user input delta x, this is the output delta y that is going to be achieved. And so this is the logic that smart contracts use to facilitate on-chain liquidity. But this form of the equation is maybe a little bit unfamiliar. You probably have seen this one, which is mostly used as the industry standard. This is the one that's in, for example, the Uniswap v1 and Uniswap v2 white papers. And this is the one that you'll see mostly spread across the rest of the DeFi space. Okay. So first we need to understand sort of how this thing works very quickly, and I've got a relatively topical example. I thought because we're here in beautiful Brussels that we should consider a Euro to USD exchange and simulate how this might work on a liquidity pool before examining how that liquidity pool's financial performance can be calculated. So I've used about a 108 to 100 conversion rate, and I'm going to show you how this formula is applied. Assume that we have a user who's on the left side of the screen here, and he's got $108. This can be a token, or it can actually, there's no reason this necessarily needs to be on-chain infrastructure. So you could imagine this being an exchange at an airport or something. But he's got $108 in his pocket. And then the smart contract, AMM in this case, has a balance of $27 and 125 euros. And if we apply the equation that I've shown here at the bottom of the screen, which is to accept as an input from the user, delta x is equal to 108, meaning this is the amount that he's hoping to change the smart contract balance by, then we can start to sort of walk through some of these steps. So for example, if delta x is 108, then that necessarily means that it's the dollar balance of the smart contract that we are designating as the X token, and the Y token becomes euros. And so this is a straightforward substitution to then calculate that the smart contract should be returning 100 euros to the user, and this is why I chose these numbers. So we subtract 100 euros from the smart contract balance and then return that back to the user. And basically this is the simplest form of a smart contract interaction liquidity exchange between user and an AMM. Now, the important thing to realize about these numbers is that I have manufactured it so that it roughly meets the exchange rate of the euro versus the US dollar when I was preparing this presentation yesterday. So we are actually getting, pretty close to, let's say, what the fair market rate is, but more importantly, it's the rate that the user was expecting to get. Okay, and this is going to become really important in a second because we're about to introduce some other things that might mess with that rate, and that adds some ambiguity as to how we should measure the performance of this portfolio. So let's imagine that the user then turns around and sells those euros back to the liquidity pool. Now, the reason why we do this just as a heuristic is to demonstrate that by itself, using this constant product equation will not generate any financial incentive for the people that are contributing liquidity to it. And so this is just the proof of that, right? By flipping the euro and dollar designations. And so now delta X becomes the 100 euros that was just bought, and completing the steps that way, we end up exactly back where we started. And we're considering this mostly from the liquidity provider or the liquidity pool perspective. And so the fact that there were 2 transactions against this pool and that at the end, the end balances are exactly the same as what the starting balances were, means that there's kind of a conflict of interest, right? And someone is essentially purchasing a free option from this liquidity pool, and that means that there is no reason to provide liquidity to it, and so this is something that needs to be addressed. Well, what you will usually be told is, yeah, but liquidity pools charge fees, right? Who thinks liquidity pools charge fees? It's okay, don't be shy, okay? Have you heard at least that liquidity pools charge fees, okay? This is kind of what they mean when they say that. They choose a number between 0 and 1, okay? And that this is then applied to that input amount. So if we say that delta X is $108, this 2 over 27 again is not incidental. I've chosen this so that we split it up into nice integers, at least for now. We're saying that the liquidity pool, it's going to accept all $108 of this transaction, but it's going to ignore the 8 when it processes the exchange rate, meaning only those 100 that are being sort of, only these 100 on the left are actually used in that computation, and that changes the output amount. And so what it means is we have to modify our equation like this, and this is, again, generally how it's presented, and it does change the output quite significantly. So now, instead of getting 100 euros back, this user is only getting 98 euros back. Now that fee, right, was $8, right? And that's, I mean, we just demonstrated that. But at the end of this transaction, can you even find it now? Like, where is that $8? Let's consider the feeless versus the fee version. Because the only difference between these, and remember, the feeless version is the one on the top and the alleged fee version is on the bottom. We're saying that in the feeless version, a user paid $108 to receive 100 euros, and in the version where a fee was applied, the user paid $108 to receive 98.4 euros. And in that second case, the protocol allegedly charged an $8 fee. But the only difference between these is actually 1.5 euros. And so where is it? Like, is this just made up? The answer is yes. It is made up. This is actually a lie that everyone just tells users in the industry. There actually are no fees on AMMs, especially not this number. And if you wanted to, you might say, fine, that 1.57 euros is a fee. Certainly not the $8, but which one do you think it is that gets reported to metrics tracking sites and reported to users who provide liquidity to these pools? Because they are told that they just earned $8 on that trade. But as we were able to demonstrate, I think rather straightforward way, that $8 is completely fiction, right? It's just something that falls out of the math in a really weird way. But in terms of its actual consequences for the people providing liquidity to that pool, it's not just abstract, it's non-existent. So there is a huge amount of dishonesty with how liquidity pools report their performance. And of course, you know that that's true, right? No one actually thinks that there is 167% APY on, such and such a pool on whatever a chain. Or that there's never a negative number reported. Like somehow all of these technologies have only ever become financially performant. And what's interesting is that usually the higher the APY, the less performant the pool, right? Because it's actually just processing a large amount of volume. And we then quote these ridiculous numbers of fees. But as I've demonstrated, those fees don't accumulate anywhere. In fact, it's just made up. It's just a lie. It's actually worse than that. So the question now I want to ask is this even a fair comparison? Because what we did there was just say, well, the user is going to be happy to trade that amount regardless, right? He wanted to sell $108 US, and so we can just charge a fee to that. And now, our analysis is showing that this $8 either is or isn't there. But is that even the correct opposite number, right? Is this a fair comparison? Because when we applied that supposed fee to this calculation, we ended up with an entirely different exchange rate. And so is it even worth stipulating that the user would commit to this transaction now that he's receiving a significantly reduced rate? And I'm not saying that he is or isn't, but I'm saying that it now adds ambiguity to your fee calculation. Because now it's like, what would a user have traded if you gave them a better rate, right? Are they rate motivated, meaning that they will only exchange at a certain rate? Or are they motivated to receive a certain number of tokens from the contract? Or are they motivated to send a certain number of tokens to the contract? There are at least 3 of these. And so I can walk through this one just quickly. And again, for posterity. I'm showing you some of the calculations that I'm doing up here. But if you want to maintain rate consistency before and after the fee assumption, this is the calculation that you do in order to work out how many tokens the user is going to sell. And so we can calculate that about 105.84. So now the user's wallet maintains a 2.16 positive balance of dollars after the transaction is performed, which means he's actually buying slightly less euros because he's spending slightly less dollars. But at least he's getting the same exchange rate, right? The one that we calculated before we applied the fee assumption. So our user is still happy, but now where is the fee, right? Now, like, none of these numbers match. We now have a situation where the protocol apparently charged $7.84 more. Like, that's the fee that one of these protocols is going to report to you that it charged. But compared to the base case, it's now the user is spending $1.16 less. So the protocol is charging more and being paid less, which is a contradiction. And somehow there's $2 of euro inventory that's completely unaccounted for in the account keeping. And that's because this isn't a good way to keep accounts. This is made up DeFi garbage. Right? It's not just impervious to financial analysis because the technology is new or something like that. It's just made up, right? It has no foundation in reality, and it never did. But it's really good for marketing, right? Because when you tell people that they're earning these fees and there's never a negative number, it does attract users to protocols. And I think that this is like we are on the cusp of like a very dangerous sort of paradigm where like all meaning is now completely lost, right, in everything that DeFi is doing. And I think the longer we continue to pursue these kinds of cheap thrills, the more detrimental it's going to be for our industry. So the take home here is that if something doesn't make sense, it probably isn't true. And in what I'm telling you today is that there is no such thing as a fee. In fact, for any exchange, there's no such thing as a fee because you have to price in the supposed fee as a part of the transaction cost. So when someone is reporting you, for example, even if you go to a normal Forex exchange, when they tell you what the price of a US dollar is in euros, it includes the fee that they're taking off of the top. There is no such thing as an exchange rate that doesn't take into account the rate that the exchange is offering you. And so if your exchange is the sole place where the prices are decided, or if your exchange is a de facto source of liquidity because it's being arbitraged versus another exchange, for example, then the rate is all that matters. And the assumption that users want to trade a certain amount of tokens becomes increasingly invalid. Now, I say here that the truth is that there's no such thing, and I can prove it, because the way that I have handled the math up until now is the same way that it's been presented to you in the DeFi literature. What I mean by that is that we take this delta x term and we multiply it by 1 minus delta, meaning that we pretend there's slightly less of an input. But actually, you can refactor this just to make it look like the x balance is slightly larger than it was. And this is an analytically redundant form, and now it has nothing to do with removing a fee from anywhere. And so that's interesting, right? How can both of these perspectives be true and yet have such a different emotional response from the way that we feel about it, or the way that we intuit through it? Okay, so what I'm just trying to point out here, and I'm going to I refuse to generally read from slides, but I have to do it a little bit in this one. The point is that when someone tells you, look, here is that input that I've removed a certain amount for before doing this calculation, there are a couple of things that I want you to immediately consider. One is, but who decided what the comparison was going to be? It's not like constant product is like some law of the universe, and that's how all finance operates. So there is no base case. You could have easily have said, well, let's compare it to constant sum, or let's compare it to some other made-up bonding curve or some other financial primitive and measure the fee versus that, right? It's like asking how long is a piece of string, right? People have to better define what it is that they're comparing the case to. And in this particular case, what I'm trying to do is to extract some of that ambiguity and make it clear for you so that you can better detect that kind of trickery when it's being presented to you elsewhere. At the end of the day, liquidity pools are just executing trading strategies, and these are always just two people trading against each other, or one person via an AMM trading with a lot of people at the same time. There is a way to measure LP performance, because we did show that there was this problem where if you go forwards and backwards and you end up at exactly the same state, then there's no financial incentive. But introducing this fee parameter, even though I think it's horribly named, it does create a financial incentive. So let's have a look at where it is. If we reverse one of these trades, you can see that all I've done is I've taken the user transactions, so swapping first 108 US dollars to 98 euros and then back again. The pool actually ends up with slightly more dollars than it started with, right? It has the same number of euros, right? 125 euros on for the smart contract, and the user still has €0 at the end of this process. But the user has lost 3.5 euros in the round trip process, whereas the smart contract has gained exactly that amount. This is much better account keeping. And it's also no longer impervious to financial analysis because we can understand exactly where this profit came from. In that first trade, and it depends on your numeraire. So again, I've chosen US dollars and euros because some people are going to prefer to price the euro in US dollars and some people would prefer to price the US dollar in euro. But however you cut it, during the first trade, there is a certain exchange rate that both the user and the AMM in a way agreed to and traded at. And in the second trade, we can do the same thing. And by comparing these rates, it becomes clear exactly where the profit incentive is and how we should analyze and interpret the data that we get from chain with respect to liquidity provider positions. So for example, in that first trade, the AMM bought 108 US dollars at 0.911 euros per US dollar, and then it sold 104.52 US dollars at 0.9416. And so this is a literal buy low, sell high trading strategy. And that is all this is. For the opposite perspective, and remember this is the same trade, I'm just flipping, so this is the inverse numeraire. You could say that this is a sell high, buy low strategy, where the euro was first sold at a high price and then bought back at a lower price. That is it. That is all there is. There has never been any more than this. Right? Out of all of those DeFi protocols over time that have always been reporting fees, that are still reporting fees, it's just wrong. It is just this. And another problem with this, and I think that one of the reasons the industry is actually still likely to stick to what I have shown is an incorrect model, is because you can't do this per user, right? Imagine all of the data that you would have to collect for every liquidity provider providing liquidity to a pool, because at the prices that they enter at and exit from that pool will impact the profitability of their position. We treat liquidity pools as if it's one thing and everyone shares the profits, but that's not true, right? Even though you can't distinguish users from each other based on the tokens that they have, the time that they spend in there and the times that they entered and exit from the pool will dictate exactly how profitable their position is, which means you cannot put on your front end that the APY for this pool is 167%. At best, you can say our top user has achieved this APY. For the token engineering students, I wanted to add a couple more slides here. And for the rest of you, I hope your eyes don't glaze over too much. You've made it this far, and thank you. I know this is a math-heavy lecture, and that can be a little uncomfortable. But what I wanted to demonstrate here is that actually there are two ways that you might take a fee from something, right? Either from the input amount or from the output amount. And you can arbitrarily rearrange that as well. In the same way that I showed that the fee from the input amount can be equally demonstrated, or so it can be equally thought of as being as just modifying the x coordinate by a small amount. The fee from the target token can also be used in a rearrangement to just modify the y token by a certain amount. And so there is a question here as to whether or not these are redundant equations, and they're absolutely not, right? These are not equal to each other. And what's interesting is that the one that the industry has used, you pay less of a fee, or you get a better exchange rate the more tokens you trade in a single transaction, which actually makes sandwich attacks easier to perform, right? And so it does beg the question as to whether or not we have appropriately addressed our defensive programming mandate to making sure that these kinds of bad actors can't do stuff, because the industry standard is actually to make it as cheap as possible to perform sandwich attacks. With the fee from the target token amount, you can, if someone performs a very large trade, they pay more than if they just paid a bunch of little trades, like split up their transaction into hundreds of smaller transactions. And that's an interesting question, right? If it's possible to game the system by changing your trade amount to force a particular rate, then how can you make sure that the rate is actually deterministic? Because today, rates are not deterministic. We pretend they are, but actually the user has some control over the amount that they pay by deciding how much they're going to trade with. And the way to do this is to take the first derivative, which again, for both of these actually comes to the same result, which shouldn't be too surprising. So these actually do converge around a single number. And then integrate it up to generate a new bonding curve. And what you'll find is that by completing this process, you actually end up back in the 2017 theory, right? Of instead of applying fees as like, these deltas and things, instead what we should be thinking of is all of these bonding curves having different weights and just switching between different bonding curves as we trade around in between them. So I think I've spoken long enough, and so thank you so much for your attention. I hope that this was informative.
Hey, thanks for this great presentation. So you said a bunch of times that accounting is bad in the first example, but it was actually not. So the leftover of the euros was in the contract, right?
Yeah.
So the fee was those like €2.
Yeah, but
where you said the
Sure.
8% was, yeah. So basically the fee incentive is there for the LP, right?
When you said that there is like €2 left in the contract,
Yeah.
right? Where?
So
So let's go up here. So this is the fee and feeless
so
version.
we started with €25. We end up with 26 points, so 1.57 euros more in the second, right? So that's the fee.
Yeah, but that's assuming that that's like compared to what? That's compared to the feeless version, but that's still arbitrary, right?
That was that was compared to the feeless version, which would make me believe that, okay, the fee is not 8%, but a lot less, right?
Yeah. So significantly less, right?
But it's a lot less because this multiplication is wrong. And I'm actually shocked that no one has pointed out that this multiplication, which you at the end showed which is the correct version.
Yeah.
So where you were dividing by 1 minus delta. So that's the correct version.
Yeah, but even then,
why is the industry, sorry to interrupt,
Go ahead.
Why is the industry using this incorrect version and no one pointed that out?
Oh, I pointed that this isn't the first time I've given this talk. The industry prefers to present big numbers. In fact, I'm actually being generous here that they do any calculation at all. A lot of the APYs are just random numbers.
Can we go back where you did the factorization?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, so this is wrong. And
yeah, well, I mean, it's right. This is the formula that they use.
I mean, mathematically, those two equations are not right. So you cannot just...
No. The equations are right.
No, they are not. So you cannot go from one to the other. You multiplied on the top side with 1 minus delta, but in the bottom side, only one factor. You should multiply both, and then you would be able to say, okay, those are the same equations. So there's the error.
No, but these aren't equivalent forms. This is a modification to say that when you compute the output amount...
But it should be equivalent form.
No, it shouldn't. It can't be, because if it's an equivalent form, there's never a profit incentive. So what I'm saying is that the constant product model cannot work, right? You need to modify it. And so what we've done is to add a modifier to the input amount that takes you off of constant product.
Isn't that the same?
No, that's very different. So, and again, it's what I'm trying to show you is that it's just a pricing model, right? There's no, like I said, there's no like law of the universe that says that these financial models need to adhere to like a geometric sequence or something, which is what we're trying to do.
I just wanted to point this out and make this clear, so thanks.
You're right, and this is why I've tried to change the color a little bit. So it's not an equivalent form, because if we just multiplied both the numerator and the denominator by that 1 minus delta, they would just cancel and you would end up back where you started. So what we're doing is actually creating a second equation by saying that I'm going to pretend that you're spending less than you are, and then I'm going to calculate the returns that you get on that. That's the model, and in general, it's espoused that this results in a fee that can be calculated this way. And what I'm trying to show is that you can't calculate it that way.
Thanks.
Hi, thanks. So, I mean, I guess your sort of main point is that people are like showing their sort of APY in a deceptive manner.
Yep.
And it's like, I have a alternative thought. I want to sort of see what you think of it.
Sure.
Like, currently, like, you can think about like the value of a liquidity, like an LP token at a given time, and nobody calculates those values. You don't go on CoinGecko and see like this is what the LP token of this to this is, but you could totally calculate that. If I cashed out on this protocol at this time, this would be worth. You can come up with a formula that like shows that at any given time. Like, what do you think about that as like an APY sort of like promotional model?
Yeah, I'm conflicted about it. So one of the things that you can do, and what some of the better protocols have tried to do, to varying levels of success, is to, instead of report an APY in one of the tokens that it's contributed to the pool, instead they measure the K growth, meaning like which is a relatively good way to measure like how much stuff gets left behind in the pool as the price washes back and forth. The problem is that even if a token is going to zero, right, the K growth can be very, very high. And I think what more to your point is you can measure like the LP token value and denominate it in whatever you want, right? So for example, let's say that we have a USDC wrapped Bitcoin liquidity pool on like Uniswap V2, and we're reporting the price of that token in like US dollars. You can still see its price appreciating like at a very, very high rate. And people will be like, wow, look how performant this pool is. When actually versus the HODL position, the value was going down like very, very quickly. And so there is an ambiguity there because you're either comparing it to the value of the pool token at the time that it began, just in its own numeraire, or you're comparing it to a competing financial instrument and working out which one would have performed better. In the case of like the WBTC USD thing, like probably, and we know this from the last bull market, people don't really care. Like when they're selling all of those Bitcoins on all the way up and getting the geometric average of whatever the start and the end price was, and then withdrawing their liquidity, they're still happy to see a bunch of USDC. But imagine if instead I wanted to denominate it in BTC, right? And I'm measuring the thing in BTC. Now, are people going to be excited when Bitcoin comes down like 80%, right? Because the value of the pool token in BTC will be worth a lot more, right? It's a choice. There is a numeraire ambiguity there, which also means that when you come in to see an APY percentage, like you have to ask so many questions. Like which numeraire is this? Like which token in the liquidity pool does this refer to? Or does it refer to like the index and against what numeraire then? So like I don't think that there will ever be a better way of reporting LP performance than just telling people what their average buy and sells are. Like literally this calculation, you have bought this many Bitcoin at this price and sold this many Bitcoin at this price. I think this is the most honest, and the most numeraire agnostic way to report things, but I do understand what you're asking, and there's going to be wiggle room to find something, but in general, we're still so far away from anything that I would consider reasonable.